The United Nations, established after World War II, was designed to be the central body of global governance, fostering international cooperation and peace. However, over the years, its structure has increasingly been criticized for its lack of representativeness, with emerging powers and nations from the global south feeling marginalized. This essay explores the dissatisfaction with the UN among Brics nations and other countries, examining calls for reform, the influence of Western powers, and ongoing efforts to create a more equitable global order. While no nation has fully withdrawn from the UN, the organization has faced periodic threats of departure from various countries, illustrating a broader dissatisfaction with its functioning. In 1965, Indonesia declared its intention to leave the UN, driven by a dispute over Malaysia's seat on the UN Security Council. Although the UN never formally recognized this move, Indonesia resumed its participation the following year under a new government. In 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte threatened to withdraw from the UN due to its criticism of his administration's handling of the war on drugs, accusing the organization of interfering in domestic affairs. These instances highlight frustrations over perceived bias and ineffectiveness within the UN's decision-making process. Proposals for U.S. withdrawal from the UN have emerged periodically, often driven by isolationist or unilateralist political groups. For instance, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act was introduced in 2017, aiming to end U.S. membership in the UN. However, the proposal failed due to concerns over diplomatic fallout and the strong influence of multilateralism on U.S. foreign policy. This reflects the complexities of completely withdrawing from an organization that plays a significant role in international diplomacy, even for powerful nations like the U.S. The Brics nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, alongside other countries from the global south, have consistently advocated for comprehensive reforms within the UN, particularly targeting the structure of the Security Council. These nations argue that the current setup disproportionately favors Western powers, as the 5 permanent members, United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, possess veto power, limiting the influence of the broader UN membership. Despite representing over 40% of the world's population and nearly 25% of global GDP, Brics nations have no adequate permanent representation in the Council, which they claim is outdated and fails to reflect modern geopolitical realities. Critics of the UN and other global organizations frequently point to perceived Western bias in both decision-making and enforcement mechanisms. This bias becomes apparent in areas like human rights, where countries like Russia and China, both Brics members, often face significant scrutiny. However, these countries argue that similar human rights issues in Western nations receive comparatively less international condemnation. For example, racial profiling and the mistreatment of indigenous populations in Western nations are not criticized as forcefully as Russia's treatment of LGBTQ+ individuals or China's actions in Tibet. This bias also extends to crisis responses, as seen during the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015 and the recent influx of Ukrainian refugees into Europe. While European countries responded swiftly and generously to Ukrainian refugees, providing them with access to work, health care, and education, refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia were met with barriers and stricter asylum policies, often justified on security grounds. This discrepancy, critics argue, is driven by racial and cultural factors, demonstrating an inherent bias in how the global community responds to humanitarian crises. The battle for influence, the role of global financial institutions. The dominance of Western nations extends beyond the UN to financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which were established after World War II to manage the global economy. The voting structures of these institutions remain skewed toward Western powers, failing to reflect the growing economic influence of emerging markets. For instance, Brics nations collectively account for nearly 25% of global GDP, yet their combined voting power in the IMF is closer to 15%. China, the world's second-largest economy, holds less than 7% of voting rights at the IMF, underscoring the misalignment between economic power and institutional representation. This underrepresentation fuels discontent among emerging economies, leading to persistent calls for recalibration of voting power. However, progress has been slow and largely symbolic, reinforcing perceptions of Western dominance and further entrenching economic inequalities between the global North and South. Proposals for a more equitable global order. In response to the perceived inequities within the UN and other global institutions, Brics nations have floated various proposals aimed at creating a more balanced global order. One of the key proposals is to expand the UN Security Council to include permanent seats for large developing nations like India and Brazil. This move would better reflect the multipolar nature of the modern world and enhance the representation of emerging economies within the Council's decision-making process. Another proposed solution is to strengthen regional organizations, such as the African Union, to foster localized governance and more effectively address regional crises. This approach emphasizes decentralized governance, enabling nations to respond to issues with greater cultural and contextual awareness. Additionally, the recent expansion of Brics to include new members like Saudi Arabia and Egypt further increases its global economic power and influence, potentially paving the way for alternative institutions that rival Western-led organizations. Challenges and the future of global governance. Despite the growing momentum for reform, internal challenges persist among Brics nations, ranging from political differences to conflicting economic priorities. The effectiveness of Brics in driving change will largely depend on its ability to overcome these hurdles and present a united front. Meanwhile, if reforms within established institutions like the UN remain elusive, Brics and other emerging powers may seek to establish alternative governance structures that better serve their interests. In conclusion, the current global order, marked by Western-centric institutions and decision-making, faces mounting pressure from Brics nations and other Global South countries for reforms. While the path to a more equitable system is fraught with challenges, the shifting balance of economic and geopolitical power makes such reforms not only necessary, but inevitable. As the world becomes more multipolar, the success of these reform efforts will shape the future of global governance and determine whether the international system can adapt to the changing realities of the 21st century.